Luton, a town no stranger to hardship, became the backdrop for one of the most brazen criminal plots in recent memory. In September 2023, 3 men launched a campaign of fear, determined to extort money from a man they believed had come into a life-changing inheritance. What started as a daylight kidnapping attempt quickly spiraled into a chilling campaign of threats and intimidation. When the abduction failed, the trio turned to arson, setting fire to the victim's fence and garden shed in a shocking display of escalation. The man and his family were left terrified, under constant watch, and unsure of how far the gang was willing to go. But behind the scenes, Bedfordshire police were closing in. Forensics, surveillance, and digital evidence would soon bring the case crashing down on the perpetrators. This is the story of how greed turned violent, and how a meticulous investigation brought 3 dangerous men to justice. The plot was ruthless, simple, and fueled by greed. 3 men, Dominic Croucher from Swansea and Jamie Williams and Paul Morell, both from Doncaster, came together with one clear objective: to extort a local man they believed had recently come into a significant amount of money. The target, known only as John Doe for legal protection, had led a quiet working-class life in Luton. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't involved in crime, but word had quietly spread that he'd inherited some money, possibly enough to buy a home outright. He told only a few people, but in tight-knit communities, whispers don't stay quiet for long. And when those whispers reached the wrong ears, the result was a plot that would spiral into violence and intimidation. By late August 2023, the conspirators had begun surveilling him. They tracked his movements, studied his routines, and mapped out the quiet moments in his day. They weren't local to Luton, but that didn't matter. Their planning was meticulous, their objective clear. They wanted money, and they were willing to abduct a man off the street to get it. The first move came on the evening of September 3rd. Just after 7:40 p.m, John Doe was walking down Havelock Road, a typical residential street. He had no idea that nearby, a white transit van sat waiting, fitted with cloned number plates and ready to vanish. Behind the wheel was Dominic Croucher, who had travelled from Swansea the previous day and stayed in a hotel overnight. On foot were Jamie Williams and another still unidentified man. The ambush was sudden. Williams and the other suspect approached quickly, grabbing the victim and dragging him to the ground. They tried to handcuff him and force him into the back of the van. It was broad daylight, and the street was far from empty, but they didn't care. The plan was built around speed and surprise, but what they hadn't counted on was resistance. John Doe fought back with everything he had. Kicking, shouting, and refusing to go quietly, he drew the attention of passers-by. One bystander intervened, shouting at the men and causing just enough panic to rattle them. Realizing their plan had failed, the attackers fled. The van roared away, and the suspects on foot disappeared into nearby streets. But in their haste, they made critical mistakes. The handcuffs used in the attack were dropped and left behind, seized by police that same night. The van, found abandoned not far from the scene, had false plates and signs of tampering. It was clear to detectives this was no random act. It was a premeditated kidnapping attempt. Soon, forensic testing on the handcuffs would return matches for both Jamie Williams and Paul Morell. That single piece of evidence would help crack open a conspiracy that had only just begun to unfold. For the victim, however, the nightmare was far from over. At first, he wondered if it had been mistaken identity. But deep down, he knew the truth. This was personal, and over the coming days, the harassment would only escalate, from failed abduction to psychological warfare. But while the gang believed they'd walked away with nothing more than a bruised ego, they had left behind the first piece of a trail, and Bedfordshire police were already starting to follow it. The failed kidnapping on Havelock Road should have marked the end of the plot, but for Dominic Croucher, Jamie Williams and Paul Morrell, it was merely the beginning. Embarrassed by their botched attempt, and still determined to secure the life-changing money they believed the victim possessed, the trio chose a new weapon: fear. 8 days after the public abduction attempt, the campaign of intimidation began in earnest. The victim, still trying to process the assault, opened his phone to find something chilling. Direct messages sent via social media, filled with veiled threats and sinister undertones. But what set these apart were the images attached, photos of his home, his car, his family, taken from different angles at different times of day. These weren't random snaps, they were proof. Proof that he was being watched, closely, constantly. The psychological impact was devastating. Suddenly, everyday routines became riddled with paranoia. Was that person in the parked car watching him? Was that stranger at the corner there by chance, or by design, and the gang hadn't finished? On the night of September 11th, under cover of darkness, the intimidation escalated to outright terror. Williams and Morrell traveled to the victim's property. Moving through side streets and back gardens, they reached the fence that bordered his home. With cold precision, they poured accelerant across the timber panels and onto the wooden garden shed. Then, with a flick of a lighter, they turned fear into flame. The fire spread rapidly. By the time emergency services arrived, the shed was engulfed and the fence was splintered and charred. The damage was more than material, it was psychological. The garden, once a space of calm and family life, had become a message board for terror. The victim and his loved ones didn't just fear another attack, they feared that next time the flames might reach their home. Police investigators, now fully aware of the gravity of the threats, began pulling together more evidence. Behind the scenes, a digital footprint was forming. The IP address used to send the social media messages led back to an address in Doncaster, Paul Morrell's. The fire, the photos, the threats, they all began to link. But for the victim, the trauma was ongoing. He had survived a kidnapping attempt, was now the target of organized stalking, and had watched his property burn, all for money he never flaunted and never offered. The gang wanted to send a message: we're watching. We won't stop. But in doing so, they had unwittingly built a damning case, one photo, one flame, one message at a time. By mid-September 2023, what began as a single attempted abduction had spiraled into a campaign of fear, arson, and digital threats. Bedfordshire police recognized they weren't dealing with a one-off incident. They were confronting an organized and escalating criminal conspiracy. The moment the victim reported the arson attack, detectives launched a major investigation, treating the case with the urgency it now demanded. The first real breakthrough came from a seemingly simple oversight: the handcuffs. Abandoned in the chaos of the failed abduction, they were sent for forensic analysis. It didn't take long. DNA tests revealed a direct match to two of the suspects, Jamie Williams and Paul Morrell. It was a clear link, placing them at the scene and, more importantly, tying them to an act of attempted kidnap. Suddenly, the investigation had a solid foundation, but police weren't stopping there. Using automatic number plate recognition, ANPR cameras across the region, they traced the movements of the white van used in the kidnapping attempt. That led them to Dominic Croucher. ANPR logs revealed the van had travelled from Swansea to Hemel Hempstead the night before the incident. CCTV from the hotel confirmed Croucher had stayed there, positioning him in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Even more damning was the convoy pattern uncovered by detectives. Alongside the white van, a rented white Mercedes was spotted, also bearing false plates. Rental records showed the vehicle had been booked by Paul Morrell. The Mercedes was filmed travelling in convoy with the van on the night of the attack, further tightening the noose around the trio. When police raided the homes of the suspects, the evidence began to pile up. At Jamie Williams's property in Doncaster, officers found the replacement number plates used to disguise the van after the attempted kidnapping. Hidden nearby was something even more telling: the key to the same set of handcuffs left at the scene. Meanwhile, a search of Paul Morell's residence uncovered the final piece of the puzzle: a wireless router linked to the IP address used to send the threatening social media messages. Those threats, which included surveillance photos and chilling warnings, had now been digitally traced back to Morell's home. It was becoming impossible for any of the men to argue coincidence. The forensic digital and surveillance evidence all pointed in the same direction, and it was leading straight to Croucher, Williams, and Morell. Conversations between the trio, recovered from their phones, revealed discussions about the journey, what to say if stopped by police, and repeated references to life-changing money. Bedfordshire police had built a case brick by brick, clue by clue. Now, with all three under suspicion and the evidence mounting, it was only a matter of time before the arrests came. The walls were closing in. After weeks of coordinated surveillance, forensic breakthroughs, and digital tracing, Bedfordshire police made their move. On September 15, 2023, officers arrested Dominic Croucher and Jamie Williams in a series of early morning raids. Paul Morell, whose involvement had become increasingly evident through both physical and digital evidence, was taken into custody just 3 days later, on September 18th. The timing wasn't accidental. Investigators had waited until the full picture had formed, until every thread of the conspiracy had been tied back to the trio. Each suspect was brought in separately, questioned over the kidnapping attempt, the online threats, and the arson attack. Presented with a mountain of evidence, DNA matches, ANPR tracking data, CCTV footage, burner phone activity, and damning social media messages, they had little room to maneuver. Confronted by the reality of the case against them, all three men ultimately chose to plead guilty to charges of conspiracy to kidnap and conspiracy to blackmail. It was a turning point for the investigation, and a moment of vindication for a victim who had been through weeks of terror. Justice was delivered at Luton Crown Court in November 2024. The courtroom was packed, with officers, legal teams, and press all watching as the details of the plot were laid bare. Prosecutors described a calculated and sinister campaign, beginning with the failed street abduction and escalating into a targeted effort to mentally and physically break a man for the sake of money. The victim, whose identity was protected throughout, had endured weeks of stalking, threats, and violence. In a statement read to the court, he described the psychological toll of the ordeal, how fear had crept into every part of his daily life, forcing him to move from the community he once called home. Her Honour Judge, Hunter K.C., made her position clear. She condemned the actions of the defendants in the strongest terms, calling them a deliberate, coordinated attempt to intimidate and extort through fear. She described the plan as organised criminal activity of the most disturbing kind, one that escalated in both danger and desperation as each stage failed to produce results. Dominic Croucher, 28, of Swansea, was sentenced to 8 years and 3 months in prison. Jamie Williams, 40, and Paul Morell, 39, both from Doncaster, and considered to have played more central roles in the plot, received 10 years and 6 months each. Their sentences reflected not only their involvement in the conspiracy, but the calculated nature of the crimes and the profound impact on their victim. For the officers involved, the successful prosecution marked the end of a complex and high-stakes investigation. For the victim, it meant closure, though the scars left behind would take far longer to heal. The impact of the conspiracy extended well beyond the immediate trauma suffered by the victim. It sent a chill through the wider Luton community, a stark reminder that even in quiet residential streets, danger can arrive without warning. The calculated and escalating nature of the crime made it all the more disturbing. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment offence. It was weeks of planning, surveillance, and intimidation, carried out with cold precision by men determined to extort money by any means necessary. Detective Constable Daniel Matcham, who led the investigation, described the case as one of the most chilling he'd seen. He emphasized how the gang's violence and threats had left the victim not only in fear for his own life, but terrified for the safety of his family. It was a vendetta designed to wear a person down, to make them feel powerless, exposed, and watched at every turn. Although the victim escaped physical harm, the psychological toll was significant. His home, once a sanctuary, had become a source of fear. Online threats and real-world arson attacks blurred the line between harassment and real danger. In the end, he was forced to leave the area altogether, uprooting his life to protect those closest to him. But there was also strength. The community rallied and law enforcement acted quickly. The arrests and convictions were not only a triumph of policing, but a message that calculated violence and fear have no place on Luton's streets. The case of Croucher, Williams, and Morell is a grim warning of how far greed can go, but also a testament to the resilience of a community and the justice that waits for those who believe they can act without consequence.